Most people assume the womb is quiet. It isn't. The intrauterine environment, measured with precision by researchers who have placed hydrophones inside amniotic fluid to record exactly what a developing fetus hears, registers between 72 and 88 decibels of continuous sound. The cardiovascular system, the digestive tract, the muffled, frequency-shifted arrival of the external world through layers of tissue and fluid, louder than a running dishwasher, measurably comparable in certain frequency ranges to the interior of a moving car. Your baby's auditory cortex was not waiting for birth to begin its work. It was already working, already processing, already by week 24 of gestation, months before birth, encoding acoustic patterns, building the neural architecture that would handle sound for a lifetime, logging the specific frequency signature of your voice with a precision that researchers at the University of Helsinki have documented in newborns within hours of delivery. They knew your voice before they saw your face. But the auditory system is only one part of what the silence was building. In the 9 months between conception and birth, a human brain constructs more neural infrastructure than it will build in any equivalent period for the rest of its life. The sensory systems come online in sequence. The stress response architecture is calibrated. The earliest templates of emotional regulation, of social recognition, of the capacity for attachment, all of it begins not in the nursery, not in the first months of life, but in the dark, in the fluid, in the environment that most parents think of as simply waiting. It was not waiting, it was working. And what it built, and how, is the most important story in your child's development that almost no one ever tells. The assumption most parents carry into the delivery room is this: birth is the beginning. The moment the person arrives, the moment the brain starts its work, the moment the story of who this child will become begins to be written. It is an understandable assumption. It is also, in the most precise neurological sense, wrong. What most parents don't realize is that the brain they are looking at in those first hours after birth is not a new brain. It is not a blank page awaiting its first entry. It is a brain that has already logged months of continuous experience, auditory, chemical, sensory, emotional, and has been quietly, systematically shaping itself in response. The neuroscientists' term for this is fetal programming. The idea, now supported by decades of research across institutions including Harvard Medical School, University College London, and the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, is that the intrauterine environment functions not as a neutral holding space, but as an active developmental signal. A source of information about the world the baby is about to enter. A set of conditions that the developing brain reads, interprets, and responds to by calibrating its own architecture accordingly. Epidemiologist David Barker, whose foundational work at the University of Southampton reshaped how scientists understand prenatal development, described it this way: while developing inside their mother, babies are receiving postcards from the outside world. These postcards tell them whether this world is dangerous or safe, whether food is plentiful or scarce. Knowing nothing else, they learn from those messages. The brain that arrives at birth has already read those postcards and written its first responses. To understand what was actually happening inside the womb, month by month, system by system, you need to follow the sequence in which a human brain comes online. Because it does not arrive all at once, it builds. Within 4 weeks of conception, before most parents even know they are pregnant, the neural tube has formed. This is the earliest structure of the central nervous system, the precursor to the brain and spinal cord. And it is already dividing at a rate that researchers describe as almost incomprehensible in its speed. 1 million new neurons generated per minute. At peak developmental velocity, the fetal brain is producing more new neural cells in a single minute than an adult brain will produce in months. By week 6, the first electrical activity is measurable, not thought, not awareness in any sense we would recognize, but the earliest functional signal of a nervous system beginning to operate. By week 8, the brain has divided into its primary regions, the structures that will eventually handle movement, emotion, memory, and conscious experience are taking their initial form, rough, unspecialized but present. The foundation is being laid, and it is exquisitely sensitive to what surrounds it. Researchers at Harvard Medical School studying first-trimester neural development have found that exposure to elevated stress hormones during this window, cortisol crossing the placental barrier in sustained concentrations, measurably alters the density and connectivity of developing neural circuits. Not catastrophically, not irreversibly, but detectably. in ways that influence the stress response architecture the baby will carry into the world. The building has begun, and the building materials are already being shaped by the environment. In the final trimester, the brain undergoes its most visible transformation. The cerebral cortex, the outermost layer of the brain, responsible for everything we associate with higher cognition, develops its characteristic folds. The smooth surface of the earlier fetal brain gives way to the deeply furrowed architecture of a brain preparing for the complexity of conscious experience. The neural connections being formed during this period are not random. They are being shaped, pruned, and reinforced by experience, by the continuous sensory input of the intrauterine environment, by the acoustic and chemical signals arriving from the world outside, by the emotional and hormonal landscape of the mother's body. Researchers at King's College London using advanced fetal MRI have documented that the pattern of cortical folding, the specific topography of the brain's surface, begins to reflect environmental influences in the third trimester. Fetuses exposed to different sensory environments show measurably different patterns of neural connectivity before birth. The brain arriving at delivery is not generic. It is already, in the most precise neurological sense, specific to the environment that built it, specific to the sounds it has encoded, the flavors it has registered, the stress hormone baseline it has calibrated against, specific, in ways that will take years to fully express, to the 9 months it spent in a classroom that had no walls, no light, and no language, but taught everything first. This is not a design flaw, it is a design. For the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, the environment a baby was born into was, with high probability, the environment their mother had inhabited during pregnancy. The climate, the food sources, the social landscape, the level of threat, these conditions change slowly enough that a brain calibrated against the maternal intrauterine environment was, in most cases, well prepared for the world it was about to enter. The fetal programming that researchers now document in such detail was not an accident of developmental biology. It was a predictive system, a mechanism by which the developing brain used available information, the hormonal, nutritional, and sensory signals of the intrauterine environment, to make its best prediction about the conditions it would face after birth, and to begin configuring itself accordingly. A fetus developing in an environment of chronic maternal stress, elevated cortisol, activated threat response, the biochemical signature of a body navigating danger, received a postcard, in Barker's formulation that read, "The world outside is difficult, resources may be scarce, threats are present, calibrate accordingly," and the brain calibrated, setting a stress response baseline that was, in the ancestral environment, where the mother's experience reliably predicted the infant's, genuinely adaptive. A more reactive stress response system in a genuinely dangerous world is not a liability, it is preparation. The mismatch, the condition that produces what modern researchers identify as elevated risk for anxiety, metabolic disorders, and stress-related conditions, occurs when the postnatal environment differs significantly from what the prenatal signals predicted. When a brain calibrated for scarcity enters abundance. When a stress response system tuned for chronic threat encounters ordinary challenge. The brain was not wrong to prepare as it did. It was working with the information it had. And understanding this, truly understanding it, transforms how we think about the earliest chapter of every human life. What makes the prenatal brain remarkable is not simply what it builds, it is how it builds. The process driving fetal brain development is called synaptogenesis, the formation of synapses, the connections between neurons through which all neural communication occurs. And the rate at which this process proceeds in the prenatal period is by any measure extraordinary. By the third trimester, the fetal brain is forming approximately 40,000 new synaptic connections per second, not per minute, per second. Each one of those connections is not random. It is shaped by activity, by the sensory experience arriving through the intrauterine environment, by the sounds being processed, the flavors being registered, the movement patterns being practiced. The foundational principle of neural development, neurons that fire together wire together, is operating at full intensity before birth. The connections that form most strongly are the ones most frequently activated, and the connections most frequently activated are the ones responding to the consistent, repeated, reliable signals of the prenatal environment. Your heartbeat, your voice, the rhythm of your movement, the chemical signature of your emotional state. These were not background conditions, they were the primary curriculum, Researchers at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences studying prenatal neural connectivity have found that the patterns of synaptic organization established before birth create what they describe as a neural scaffold, a foundational architecture of connection and response that postnatal experience builds upon rather than replaces. The brain does not start over at birth, it continues, building on what was already there, refining what was already formed, expressing, in the months and years of postnatal life, what was laid down in the months before. Which means that the foundation of your child's capacity for emotional regulation, for social connection, for learning and attention and the management of stress, all of it, was not built in their first year of life, it was built in yours. The science of prenatal brain development carries a clinical dimension that deserves to be stated clearly and carefully. The evidence that chronic prenatal stress influences fetal brain development is robust. It is replicated across multiple research institutions, multiple methodologies, multiple populations. It is not disputed. But here is what that evidence does not say. It does not say that stress during pregnancy causes damage. It does not say that a difficult pregnancy produces a damaged brain. It does not say that a mother's anxiety, grief, financial hardship, relationship strain, the ordinary and extraordinary difficulties of a human life translate directly and irreversibly into neurological deficits in her child. The brain is not that brittle. What the research actually shows is a system of calibration, one that responds to chronic, sustained elevation of stress hormones over extended periods, not to the normal fluctuations of a life being lived, and one that operates within a larger context of resilience, plasticity, and the remarkable capacity of the developing brain to adapt, recover, and reorganize in response to supportive postnatal experience. The clinical concern, the pattern that researchers studying prenatal development treat as warranting attention, is sustained, unaddressed, chronic stress over extended periods, combined with inadequate postnatal support. Not difficulty, chronic, unmitigated, unsupported difficulty. If you are pregnant and struggling with anxiety, with circumstances, with the ordinary weight of carrying a life while managing your own, the most important thing the research says is not that your stress is harming your baby, it is that your support matters, for both of you. Seek it, accept it, treat the care of your own nervous system during pregnancy, not as a luxury, but as exactly what the science says it is, prenatal care, for two. So go back to the beginning. Not the beginning you remember, the delivery room, the first cry, the specific gravity of that first moment of holding. Further back, to the months before that, to the environment your baby inhabited while their brain was doing the most extraordinary thing it will ever do, to the sounds they were encoding, the flavors they were registering, the stress response system they were calibrating, quietly, continuously, in the dark. They were not waiting, they were becoming, and you were the world they were becoming in response to. Your heartbeat was the first rhythm their auditory cortex encoded. Your voice was the first acoustic pattern their developing brain logged with enough repetition to remember. The biochemical signature of your emotional life, your joy, your anxiety, your calm, your difficulty, arrived through the placenta as information, and a brain that had no other source of data about the world used it to make its best predictions about what was coming. That brain arrived in your arms with a history, not a long history, not an irreversible one, not one that determines, finally and completely, who your child will become, but a real one, a history of 9 months of continuous experience, of sounds learned and flavors registered and rhythms encoded and stress response systems calibrated, of a nervous system building itself, day by day, synapse by synapse, against the only environment it had ever known, you. And here is what the science says about that history. What it says with a consistency and a clarity that should reach every parent who has ever worried about what the difficult months might have cost their child. The foundation is not the building. The brain that arrives at birth, shaped by everything that came before, is not a finished structure. It is a starting point, one built with more care and more complexity than most parents ever get to see. But a starting point nonetheless. What comes after still matters enormously. The voice that your baby encoded in the womb is the same voice they will spend their first years learning to read, to respond to find safety in. The stress response system calibrated against your biochemistry is the same system that your presence, your calm, your consistent and responsive caregiving will continue to shape for years after birth. The story did not begin in the delivery room, but it is far from over. And the chapters you are writing now, in the feeding and the holding and the exhausted, imperfect, irreplaceable daily act of being present, are being written on a foundation that was laid, with extraordinary care, in the 9 months before you ever held them. They knew you before they saw you, and they have been responding to you ever since. Leave a comment below and tell me, was there a moment during your pregnancy when you felt somehow that something was already happening? That the person taking shape was already communicating something? Because now you know, they were.